Have you ever been judged by someone simply because you're different? Now imagine that judgment turning into violence, all in front of your own home. Imagine a neighbor, someone who should have been a part of your community, seeing your son, your disabled son, and calling him a threat. Not just in passing, but in a way that would change your family's life forever. This isn't a scene from a movie or some twisted story, it happened to us. And it all started with a single moment. My son, just trying to ask for directions, ended up being slammed to the ground by a woman who couldn't see past his disability. We had just moved to what seemed like a peaceful neighborhood, hoping to find a fresh start. But little did we know, this place would be the backdrop for a nightmare we couldn't have imagined. We thought it was the kind of place where everyone minded their own business, where people helped each other out. But there was one neighbor, a woman, let's call her HOA Karen, who thought she had the right to define who was welcome and who wasn't. She didn't know my son, but the moment she laid eyes on him, her mind was made up. He was a threat. And it wasn't because of anything he had done or said, it was simply because he was different. He wasn't like the other kids in the neighborhood, and to her, that was enough to make him dangerous. What happened next shook me to the core. In broad daylight, right outside our house, I watched as my son was slammed to the ground. The violence was swift, unexpected, and brutally cruel. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. How could someone be so callous? But this wasn't just about one woman's actions, it was about everything that followed. The way people looked the other way, the way the system struggled to take our side, and the way we had to fight to make sure my son's voice was heard. This is the story of how one woman's hate-filled judgment against a disabled child escalated into a traumatic event that we'll never forget. It's a story of injustice, of courage, and of standing up when everything seems stacked against you. What happened when HOA Karen called my son a threat, and what we had to do to get justice, will leave you questioning the very foundation of what makes a person worthy of respect and dignity. So, stay with me as I take you through the journey of that fateful day, and how we fought back. My son, Adam, is the kind of person who lights up a room without even trying. He's 14, with a heart as big as anyone could ask for, always looking for ways to help others, always smiling, even when life has thrown its hardest punches at him. Adam was born with cerebral palsy, a condition that affects his mobility and motor skills. But don't let that fool you, he's far from what some might expect. Adam has always had a spirit that refuses to be defined by his disability. He's brilliant in ways people don't always see at first glance. His joy for life is infectious, and his determination to keep up with the world around him is something I've never seen in anyone else. But while Adam may not move through the world like most people, he moves through it with an unshakable grace, overcoming obstacles every day. He uses a motorized wheelchair, a tool that helps him get from place to place. To him, it's no different than anyone else using their legs to walk, it's just a way to keep moving forward. And yet, some people couldn't see past the wheelchair. They saw it as a sign of weakness, a sign of vulnerability. That's where HOA Karen came in. Karen was a neighbor, one of the first people I met when we moved into the neighborhood. At first, she seemed like just another one of those overly involved homeowners, always up in everyone's business, making sure things were proper. But there was something different about her, a sharpness in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way she always had something to say, or maybe it was the way she never seemed to quite understand Adam. She didn't know him. She didn't know his story, his struggles, or the challenges he faced daily. But that didn't stop her from judging him. The first time Adam came into contact with her was completely innocent. He was out for a walk, like any teenager would be. He had a question for her, something small, like directions. But to Karen, Adam wasn't a teenage boy asking for help, he was a threat. That was the moment things changed. That was when her hatred started to fester, and it would eventually boil over into something far more destructive. But Karen wasn't the only person in the neighborhood. There were others too, neighbors who saw what happened that day and chose to remain silent. People who saw what Karen did and turned a blind eye. In a way, they were just as much a part of this story as she was. Adam, though, never let any of it get to him. He believed in people, believed that good would always outweigh bad. Little did he know, he was about to be tested in ways that would shake his faith to the core. We had just moved into the neighborhood a few months ago, full of excitement and hope for a fresh start. The house was perfect, a cozy two-story home on a quiet street, with a well-kept garden and a neighborhood that seemed to promise peace and tranquility. It was the kind of place you dream about when you're looking for somewhere safe and nurturing for your family. I thought it would be the perfect spot for Adam, a place where he could live without fear of being judged, a place where we could be just another family, blending in like everyone else. But it didn't take long to realize that things weren't as peaceful as they seemed. From the very first day we arrived, HOA Karen had been watching us. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things here and there. A passing glance as we unloaded boxes into the house, a brief nod when I waved hello, but there was something unsettling about the way she looked at us. Or rather, the way she looked at Adam. I could sense it, the way her eyes lingered just a moment too long on his wheelchair, the small shake of her head as if she was disapproving of something. It wasn't just curiosity, it was judgment, pure and simple. I tried to ignore it at first, assuming I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. In the weeks that followed, her behavior only became more apparent. Adam had been trying to fit in, as any teenager would. He wanted to make friends, to be a part of the neighborhood. But the more he tried, the more he seemed to be met with coldness. No one would offer him a hand when he needed it. No one would even look him in the eye. They would look away, pretend they didn't see him, as if he wasn't even there. It was as if the wheelchair he used to get around had become a barrier between him and the world. The other kids would run off when he approached, not even giving him a chance to speak. And then there was Karen, who always seemed to be nearby, watching from her window, always ready with a comment or a disapproving glance. Every time Adam passed by her house, she would step outside, making sure to stare him down. I could see it in her face, the disdain, the superiority. It was as though she was waiting for something to happen, looking for an excuse to prove her point that Adam didn't belong here. I knew this wasn't just about a disagreement, this was personal. She had made up her mind the moment she saw him that he wasn't fit for this neighborhood. One afternoon, Adam came to me after walking through the neighborhood, his face downcast, his shoulders slumped. I could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When I asked him what happened, he hesitated, looking up at me with a mix of confusion and sadness. I tried to talk to Mrs. Karen, he said quietly. I just asked her for directions, but she didn't want to help me. That moment stuck with me. Here was my son, trying to be like any other teenager, trying to navigate this new world, asking for help from a neighbor, and instead, he was met with silence, followed by a cold refusal. I had seen the way Karen had looked at him, but now, I could feel the tension building. It was becoming clear, this wasn't going to end with a simple glance or a missed opportunity for a friendship. Something was about to snap. What I didn't realize at the time was that the tension between us and Karen was just the beginning. Every cold interaction, every hateful look, every word unspoken, was adding fuel to a fire that was already beginning to burn. The quiet neighborhood that once seemed like an ideal place to live was quickly becoming a battleground, a place where judgment, hatred, and fear were brewing just beneath the surface. And one day, the inevitable clash would happen. I didn't know when, but I knew it was coming. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it getting harder to breathe. The storm was approaching, and it was only a matter of time before everything changed. That afternoon, everything went wrong. Adam had been excited. It was one of those rare sunny days in our neighborhood, where the kind of warmth that wraps around you like a blanket makes everything feel right. Adam had decided to go for a short walk, like he always did, to get some fresh air and clear his mind. He didn't need much, just a few minutes of peace away from the house, away from the whispers and the stares. But this time was different. As Adam made his way down the sidewalk, the familiar sound of his motorized wheelchair buzzing gently behind him, he noticed Karen standing on her front porch. At first, he didn't think anything of it. She was always out there, pacing back and forth, or tending to her garden with that air of authority, as though she had something to prove to the world. Adam, ever the friendly soul, waved his hand in her direction, just trying to be polite. But Karen, as usual, didn't wave back. She stood still for a moment, watching him with that same cold, calculating gaze that made my skin crawl. Adam had gotten used to her, or so he thought. He had always believed that people would see him for who he was, not for the wheelchair, not for the disability. So, with his usual kindness, Adam decided to approach her, just as he would with anyone else in the neighborhood. He rolled his wheelchair closer to her front steps, a simple request on his lips. "Excuse me, Mrs. Karen, could you help me with directions? I'm trying to find the nearest park." It was a question anyone else would have answered with a smile, a quick gesture pointing in the right direction. But Karen, instead of responding with even the slightest hint of politeness, stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Her lips twisted into a tight frown, and her eyes hardened. There was a coldness there, a darkness that Adam hadn't seen before. At first, it was the silence that struck him. The kind of silence that weighs heavy in the air, like something's wrong but you can't put your finger on it. He waited, hoping she would simply tell him which way to go, but instead, she stepped forward, her voice low, her words sharp. "You don't belong here," she said, her eyes flickering down to his wheelchair with disgust. "You're a threat. You've been nothing but trouble since you arrived." Adam blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He had asked her for directions, for help, nothing more. He had never once thought that asking for something as simple as directions would make her think he was a threat. His heart sank, the words cutting through him like a knife. But he didn't back down. "I'm just trying to get to the park," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "I just need directions. I'm not causing any harm." But Karen wasn't listening. Her face twisted into a mask of disdain, and without warning, she moved toward him, her eyes filled with fury. In that moment, everything happened so fast. Before Adam could react, Karen's hands were on him, shoving him, slamming his wheelchair backward with enough force to make him lose control. The wheelchair tipped, and Adam was thrown to the ground, the cold concrete biting into his skin. I heard the crash from inside the house, the sickening sound of metal and flesh colliding. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest. And there she was, Karen, standing over my son, her chest heaving with anger, looking down at him as if he was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Get up," she screamed, her voice high-pitched, almost hysterical. "You're a danger to everyone around you." My heart was pounding in my ears as I rushed outside, calling Adam's name. He was on the ground, disoriented, his face pale, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. This wasn't the world he knew. This wasn't the kindness he believed in. "Mom. I didn't do anything," he whispered, his voice shaking. And that was the moment I knew everything had changed. It wasn't just about a single act of violence, it was about the dehumanization of my son. It was about the cruelty of a woman who saw a child in a wheelchair as a threat, simply because he wasn't like everyone else. The weight of it all crashed over me, but I knew I had to stay strong. Adam needed me now more than ever. I stood up and faced Karen, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, my voice breaking the tension in the air. "He's just a child." Karen's eyes flared with contempt. "He's a danger," she muttered, turning away from us, as though she had done nothing wrong. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. I wasn't going to let anyone treat my son like that. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't just an incident. This was the beginning of a fight for justice, for dignity, and for my son's right to live in this world without fear. And it was only just beginning. That afternoon, everything went wrong. Adam had been excited. It was one of those rare sunny days in our neighborhood, where the kind of warmth that wraps around you like a blanket makes everything feel right. Adam had decided to go for a short walk, like he always did, to get some fresh air and clear his mind. He didn't need much, just a few minutes of peace away from the house, away from the whispers and the stares. But this time was different. As Adam made his way down the sidewalk, the familiar sound of his motorized wheelchair buzzing gently behind him, he noticed Karen standing on her front porch. At first, he didn't think anything of it. She was always out there, pacing back and forth, or tending to her garden with that air of authority, as though she had something to prove to the world. Adam, ever the friendly soul, waved his hand in her direction, just trying to be polite. But Karen, as usual, didn't wave back. She stood still for a moment, watching him with that same cold, calculating gaze that made my skin crawl. Adam had gotten used to her, or so he thought. He had always believed that people would see him for who he was, not for the wheelchair, not for the disability. So, with his usual kindness, Adam decided to approach her, just as he would with anyone else in the neighborhood. He rolled his wheelchair closer to her front steps, a simple request on his lips. "Excuse me, Mrs. Karen, could you help me with directions? I'm trying to find the nearest park." It was a question anyone else would have answered with a smile, a quick gesture pointing in the right direction. But Karen, instead of responding with even the slightest hint of politeness, stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Her lips twisted into a tight frown, and her eyes hardened. There was a coldness there, a darkness that Adam hadn't seen before. At first, it was the silence that struck him. The kind of silence that weighs heavy in the air, like something's wrong but you can't put your finger on it. He waited, hoping she would simply tell him which way to go, but instead, she stepped forward, her voice low, her words sharp. "You don't belong here," she said, her eyes flickering down to his wheelchair with disgust. "You're a threat. You've been nothing but trouble since you arrived." Adam blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He had asked her for directions, for help, nothing more. He had never once thought that asking for something as simple as directions would make her think he was a threat. His heart sank, the words cutting through him like a knife. But he didn't back down. "I'm just trying to get to the park," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "I just need directions. I'm not causing any harm." But Karen wasn't listening. Her face twisted into a mask of disdain, and without warning, she moved toward him, her eyes filled with fury. In that moment, everything happened so fast. Before Adam could react, Karen's hands were on him, shoving him, slamming his wheelchair backward with enough force to make him lose control. The wheelchair tipped, and Adam was thrown to the ground, the cold concrete biting into his skin. I heard the crash from inside the house, the sickening sound of metal and flesh colliding. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest. And there she was, Karen, standing over my son, her chest heaving with anger, looking down at him as if he was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Get up," she screamed, her voice high-pitched, almost hysterical. "You're a danger to everyone around you." My heart was pounding in my ears as I rushed outside, calling Adam's name. He was on the ground, disoriented, his face pale, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. This wasn't the world he knew. This wasn't the kindness he believed in. "Mom. I didn't do anything," he whispered, his voice shaking. And that was the moment I knew everything had changed. It wasn't just about a single act of violence, it was about the dehumanization of my son. It was about the cruelty of a woman who saw a child in a wheelchair as a threat, simply because he wasn't like everyone else. The weight of it all crashed over me, but I knew I had to stay strong. Adam needed me now more than ever. I stood up and faced Karen, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you? I shouted, my voice breaking the tension in the air. "He's just a child." Karen's eyes flared with contempt. "He's a danger," she muttered, turning away from us, as though she had done nothing wrong. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. I wasn't going to let anyone treat my son like that. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't just an incident. This was the beginning of a fight for justice, for dignity, and for my son's right to live in this world without fear. And it was only just beginning. As I knelt down beside Adam, my heart was racing, and the world around me seemed to blur into a haze. I could feel the warmth of the blood rushing through my veins, but my hands were cold as I gently helped him sit up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He couldn't make sense of what had just happened, and neither could I. All he had wanted was directions, a simple request, but what he received in return was something I would never have imagined. Not in my worst nightmares. The crash of the wheelchair hitting the ground still echoed in my ears as I looked up at Karen, who stood there like a statue, her eyes cold and uncaring. I wanted to scream at her, to demand an apology, to make her understand the pain she had caused. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, my hands trembling, staring at the woman who had just assaulted my son. The anger that had built up inside me was matched only by the deep sadness in my heart. But what was even worse than Karen's actions was the silence that followed. The neighbors, those who had been watching from their windows, were now emerging from their homes, but none of them came forward to help. They looked at us, some with pity, others with indifference, but none of them took a step to intervene. It was as if they had already decided that what had happened didn't concern them. They just watched, silent witnesses to a crime they could have stopped. I could feel their eyes on us, and I could feel the judgment weighing down on me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about a community that had turned its back on us, a community that allowed hatred and prejudice to thrive. How could they just stand there and do nothing? How could they let this happen and pretend it wasn't their problem? In that moment, I realized that our fight was no longer just against Karen, it was against an entire mindset, a belief that some people weren't worthy of respect simply because they were different. Adam was still shaking, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair as if trying to hold on to something solid, something he could control. He was scared, and I couldn't blame him. He had never experienced anything like this before. He had always been so trusting, so open-hearted, and now, that innocence had been shattered. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with confusion, and whispered, "Mom, why did she do that?" The question hung in the air, and I didn't have an answer. Not then. Not yet. I pulled him into my arms, trying to comfort him, trying to make him feel safe, even though I felt anything but safe myself. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. But I couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not when Adam needed me to be strong. As we waited for the police to arrive, I saw the familiar faces of some of the neighbors passing by. But not one of them stopped. Not one of them asked if we were okay. Instead, they kept walking, pretending they didn't see what had just unfolded on their doorstep. It was like a wall had been built between us, a wall of silent complicity that made it clear, they were not on our side. When the police finally arrived, I could see the reluctance in their eyes as they approached. This wasn't a simple case of assault. It wasn't a clear-cut situation where someone had been harmed in a public place. No, this was a case where a disabled child had been violently attacked in his own neighborhood, and that was something no one was ready to confront. I could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty that hung over us. Would they take us seriously? Would they do anything to help? Adam, still in shock, tried to explain what had happened, but his words were disjointed, his mind still reeling from the chaos. The officer nodded, taking notes, but I could tell he was already making judgments. The disbelief in his eyes was palpable. It was as if he couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that someone like Karen, someone who looked like the picture of respectability, could do something so cruel. That was when I realized something even more terrifying. This wasn't just a fight against one woman. It was a fight against the very system that allowed people like her to get away with cruelty. It was a fight against the apathy of the community, and it was a fight for my son's dignity, a dignity that had been ripped away in an instant. As the police spoke with Karen, I felt the heaviness of the moment settle on me. This wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what was coming next. The road ahead was going to be long and difficult, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let my son face this alone. We would fight. Together, we would make sure the world knew what had happened, and we would make sure it never happened again. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, anger, confusion, and a desperate need for answers. The moment the police arrived, I felt a wave of mixed emotions flood over me. Part of me was relieved. I thought surely this would be the moment when the truth would come to light. But another part of me was skeptical, because deep down, I knew that the system wasn't always kind to people like us, people who were already being judged before they even had the chance to speak. The officers, 2 of them, arrived at our doorstep with their usual professionalism, but something in the air felt off. They didn't look at Adam the way a parent would, with concern and empathy. Instead, they looked at him with a detached air, as if he were just another case to deal with. And then they looked at me, the mother, who was trying to keep it all together, but failing to hide the tremor in my voice. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened?" the officer asked, his tone matter-of-fact, almost clinical. I nodded, my hands still trembling as I tried to gather my thoughts. I explained the situation, the conversation between Adam and Karen, the way she had shoved him to the ground. I told them about the stairs, the judgment, how Karen had treated my son as if he were a threat. When I finished, I expected sympathy, something that would tell me the police were on our side. But the look on the officer's face was more of disbelief than concern. "So, let me get this straight," he said slowly, almost as if he couldn't believe his own words. "She pushed him down, because he asked for directions?" I nodded, the weight of the absurdity hitting me all over again. It was hard to comprehend that such a simple act, asking for help, could turn into something so violent. But there was no denying it. Adam had been hurt, physically and emotionally. And still, the officer seemed unsure how to proceed. I glanced at Adam, who was sitting quietly in the living room, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. He was still processing what had happened, and I could see the confusion on his face. He didn't understand why this was happening to him. Why, of all people, had he become the target of this hate? The officer then turned to Karen, who had been asked to stay in her house until they had all the details. I knew this was when things would get tricky. Would they take her side because she was the respectable neighbor? Would they believe her when she claimed it was just a misunderstanding? Or would they finally see the truth? When the officers spoke to Karen, I couldn't help but notice the difference in the way they treated her. Her demeanor was calm, controlled, far too calm for someone who had just physically attacked a child. She spoke confidently, her words carefully measured, as though she had prepared a defense long before the police arrived. She claimed Adam had threatened her, that his wheelchair had somehow made her feel unsafe. She painted herself as the victim, making it seem like she had done nothing wrong. But as I listened, I felt my blood boil. There was no mention of the force she had used to slam my son to the ground. There was no acknowledgement of her judgment or cruelty. Instead, she was turning the story around, making it seem like she had been forced into an act of self-defense. I knew this wasn't right, and I couldn't stay silent. I spoke up, my voice shaking with the anger I had been holding back. "You're lying," I said, my words harsh and raw. "You attacked my son because you couldn't stand the fact that he was different. You saw a disabled child, and you decided he was a threat. You hurt him, and now you're trying to cover it up." The officer's eyes flickered between us, but he didn't intervene. I could see it in his eyes, he was caught between 2 conflicting stories. One was the truth, the other was a lie wrapped in a carefully crafted narrative. In that moment, I realized that this was going to be a battle a battle for the truth, for justice. And it wasn't going to be easy. Days turned into weeks as the investigation dragged on. The police interviews, the constant back and forth, and the growing tension in the neighborhood only made things more difficult. But what weighed heaviest on me was the feeling of being unheard. The officers had questioned Adam, but their questions seemed pointed, trying to catch him in some contradiction, trying to prove that maybe he wasn't as innocent as he appeared. They didn't see my son for what he was, a child who had done nothing wrong but ask for directions. In the midst of the investigation, I felt the full weight of the legal system pressing down on us. Every word, every gesture from the officers seemed to tell me that our fight wasn't just against Karen, it was against a system that didn't seem to value my son's worth, a system that was too quick to dismiss his pain. I knew it wasn't just about what had happened that day, it was about something much bigger. It was about changing the narrative, about proving that no one, no matter their disability, should ever be treated this way. But as the investigation unfolded, I realized that if we wanted justice, we would have to fight for it. And I was ready for that fight, no matter how long it took. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence. The lies. The way Karen had twisted the truth and manipulated everyone around her into believing she was the victim. It was unbearable. Every day that passed without any real action taken against her made the anger inside me grow. But it wasn't just anger, it was a fierce determination, the kind of resolve that only a mother could understand. This wasn't just about what she did to my son, this was about standing up for him, for his right to live without fear, for the respect he deserved. I had tried to stay calm, to go through the right channels, police reports, legal advice, even talking to neighbors who I thought might be on our side. But every time I looked at Adam, his eyes full of confusion and hurt, I knew none of it was enough. I couldn't sit back and let her get away with this. I had to confront her. The moment I decided, there was no turning back. It wasn't just about seeking an apology or expecting her to admit what she had done. It was about holding her accountable, forcing her to face the truth of what she had done to my son. She had made him feel like he didn't belong, like he was a threat. She had taken away his safety, his peace of mind, and I wasn't going to let her continue to walk around like she had done nothing wrong. That evening, after everything had settled down, I walked out of my house with one goal in mind, to confront Karen. Adam, thankfully, was in the living room with his favorite book, not quite understanding what I was about to do, but I could see the quiet reassurance in his face. He trusted me to handle this. I couldn't disappoint him. I made my way to Karen's front door, my feet heavy with every step. As I approached, the familiar chill of her gaze seemed to follow me, even though she wasn't there. I could almost feel her watching me from behind those blinds, waiting for me to make my move. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I rang the doorbell. When she opened the door, there was that same smug look on her face, the one that told me she had no remorse, no understanding of the harm she had caused. For a brief moment, I stood there, just looking at her. The woman who had humiliated my son, who had shoved him to the ground without a second thought. The woman who had poisoned the atmosphere of this whole neighborhood with her judgment. Her voice was cold, almost dismissive, as she crossed her arms over her chest. "What is this about?" she asked, as if she didn't already know. Without warning, the words came tumbling out of me, faster than I could hold back. "You hurt my son. You attacked him because you saw him as a threat, simply because he's different from you. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." She scoffed, taking a step back. "You're overreacting. He's fine. He's not hurt. You're just trying to make me the bad guy here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had to dig my nails into my palms to keep from losing control, to keep my voice steady. "You shoved him. You took away his dignity, his safety. How could you look at a child in a wheelchair and treat him like that? He was just asking for directions. Just trying to be like everyone else, and you made him feel like a threat. You don't get to do that and walk away like nothing happened." Karen's face twisted, the facade of the calm and collected neighbor cracking for a moment. But she quickly recovered, her voice now laced with venom. He's a burden. People like him don't belong here. I was protecting the neighborhood. The words hit me like a slap to the face. I had heard enough. My body was shaking, but I wasn't scared anymore. I was done holding back. You don't get to decide who belongs here, I snapped. No one asked for your judgment. You don't get to make people feel like they're less than human because they're different. You're the one who doesn't belong here, Karen. And I will make sure everyone knows what you did. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, the anger still simmering in my chest. I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. And in that moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe fear, maybe regret, or maybe it was just the realization that she couldn't control this anymore. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter, but no less harsh. You think you can just turn everyone against me? People will see you for what you really are, making a scene over nothing. But I was already turning away, my resolve stronger than ever. I'm not making a scene, Karen. I'm standing up for my son. And I will make sure everyone knows the truth. As I walked back to my house, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The confrontation had been long overdue, but it had been necessary. It wasn't just about what Karen had done to my son, it was about what I had done for him. I had stood up for him, in a way that I knew would matter more than anything else. I wasn't going to let anyone treat him as less than. Not while I had breath in my body. The day of the trial finally arrived, but it wasn't the straightforward fight I had imagined. It was more complicated than I could have ever prepared for. I thought I was walking into a courtroom where justice would prevail, where the truth would finally be seen and my son's suffering would be recognized. But the reality of the legal system hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just a matter of right or wrong, it was a matter of who could control the narrative. I walked into the courtroom with Adam by my side, his wheelchair now more than just a tool for mobility, it had become a symbol of our fight. It felt like the whole room was judging us from the moment we entered. The stark walls, the cold benches, the air thick with the weight of legal jargon, it was overwhelming. But it was nothing compared to what was to come. Karen, of course, was there. She was sitting confidently across from us, her perfectly pressed suit, her cold demeanor. She looked so composed, like nothing was wrong. She was surrounded by her lawyer, a sharp, calculated man who spoke with a polished, rehearsed tone. I could already see where this was going. Karen's defense was clear, she had acted in self-defense, that Adam was a threat, and that she had been protecting her neighborhood from a dangerous person. It was the same story she had spun before, but now she had the full force of the legal system backing her. The prosecution, on the other hand, was doing their best, but I could sense their hesitation. They were playing it safe, relying on the basic facts, the medical reports that proved Adam wasn't physically harmed beyond a few scrapes and bruises. But what they didn't seem to grasp was that this wasn't just about physical harm, it was about the emotional and psychological damage she had caused. The ridicule, the hate, the feeling of being unsafe in your own community, those things couldn't be measured in medical reports. When it was our turn to speak, I could feel the weight of the room on my shoulders. I had prepared myself for this moment, but when I saw the judge looking down at me, when I heard the soft murmurs of the audience, my words seemed to fall short. I could hear the tremble in my voice as I explained what had happened that day. I told them about Adam's innocence, how he had simply asked for directions and had been met with violence. I told them how Karen had looked at him with disgust, how she had shoved him to the ground, not out of fear, but out of hatred. It was during my testimony that things took an unexpected turn. One of the neighbors, someone I had barely spoken to in the months we had lived there, stood up. His voice was shaky, but his words were clear. He described the events of that day from his window. He had seen Karen push Adam to the ground, heard the harsh words she had spoken to him. His testimony didn't add much in terms of physical evidence, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of the jury. For the first time, someone had spoken out against Karen. For the first time, the truth was being heard. But as the trial wore on, I began to realize something darker. The other neighbors, the ones who had witnessed the event from their windows, had all remained silent. They didn't step forward, didn't raise their voices in support of Adam. It was as if they were afraid to speak up, afraid of the backlash from someone like Karen, who had ingrained herself so deeply in the fabric of the neighborhood. The silence was deafening, and it made me wonder, how many others had silently watched and said nothing? How many had chosen to ignore the cruelty right in front of their faces? When Karen took the stand, her cold, practiced smile never faltered. She spun her story of self-defense, painting herself as the victim in all of this. She had no remorse in her eyes, only a sense of entitlement, as if she believed the world owed her this victory. I could see it clearly now, she was more than just a neighbor who had hurt my son. She was a woman who had never been challenged in her life, a woman who thought she could get away with anything because of her position in the community. And now, she was trying to manipulate the court into believing she had done nothing wrong. The trial dragged on for hours, with twists and turns that I hadn't expected. The defense brought in character witnesses who tried to paint Adam as a disruptive force, a burden on society, though there was nothing in his history to support this. The prosecution countered with medical reports and photos of Adam's injuries, but they didn't seem to sway the jury as much as I hoped. The longer it went, the more I realized just how complex this battle was. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a war of perceptions, of influence, and of power. As the day drew to a close, I felt the exhaustion creeping into my bones. I didn't know what would happen next. Would the truth win? Or would Karen's manipulation be enough to convince the court that her actions were justified? I couldn't stop thinking about Adam and how far we'd come, from that first moment he was hurt to now, standing in this courtroom, hoping for justice. I didn't know what the outcome would be, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to stop fighting until my son's story was heard, until Karen was held accountable for what she had done. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge stood up, his gavel in hand. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Adam sat beside me, his hands nervously clutching the arms of his wheelchair. He had been so brave throughout the trial, so composed, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes now. He didn't know what to expect, just like the rest of us. The judge's voice broke the silence. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the court has reached a decision. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing. This was the moment we had all been waiting for, the moment that would decide whether or not Karen would face the consequences of her actions. The judge paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room before he spoke again. The defendant, Karen, is found guilty of assaulting a minor, causing emotional distress, and making false statements under oath. The court orders a restraining order to be placed against her, and she is to attend anger management classes as part of her sentence. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was over. It was really over. But as the words sank in, a strange feeling washed over me. There was relief, yes. Finally, after everything we had been through, we had won. But there was also a deep sadness. Sadness for the pain that Adam had endured, sadness for the way Karen had treated him, and sadness for the fact that the damage had already been done. This victory, while important, wouldn't erase the scars she had left on us, particularly on my son. The relief I had imagined would come so easily didn't feel as sweet as I expected. Instead, it felt hollow, as if the justice we had fought so hard for wasn't enough to undo the cruelty we had experienced. The courtroom had been our battleground, but the emotional wounds were still raw, still fresh. Karen might have been held accountable, but no punishment would ever truly make up for the humiliation and fear Adam had been forced to endure. As I glanced over at my son, I could see a faint smile forming on his lips. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. It was the smile of a child who had finally been heard, whose voice had finally been validated. And for that, I could find some peace. The judge's gavel came down again, marking the end of the trial, and with it, the beginning of our healing. Adam had won something more than a court case. He had regained his sense of worth, his dignity. And as we left the courtroom, I knew this was only the first step. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were finally moving forward. The verdict was in, and for the first time in months, a sense of relief washed over me. But even as we walked out of that courtroom, I knew the journey wasn't truly over. The trial, the confrontation, the pain, it had all been part of a much larger story, one that was still unfolding. Karen had been held accountable for her actions, but the emotional scars left on Adam were not so easily erased. In the days that followed, I watched my son closely. He was still adjusting, still processing everything that had happened. The pain he had experienced wasn't something that could be fixed with a ruling, no matter how just. He had been made to feel like an outsider, like he didn't belong, simply because of who he was. But what was incredible to witness was his resilience. Adam, despite it all, was finding his way back to the boy he had been before the incident, the one who laughed easily, who dreamed big, and who had so much love to give. We spent more time together as a family in the weeks after the trial, focusing on the simple things that brought us joy. We took long walks, visited the park where Adam had been shoved to the ground, and slowly, piece by piece, rebuilt the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were just going through the motions, but we were healing. We were moving forward. The neighborhood that had once felt like a prison of judgment and fear began to shift, too. The people who had turned away when Adam was hurt, the ones who had kept their silence, some of them began to speak up. Slowly, things changed. The community that had allowed Karen's hatred to go unchecked started to see what had happened, and they began to understand the importance of standing up for what was right. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but it was a step in the right direction. Adam wasn't just a survivor of that ordeal, he was a fighter. And that's what I wanted him to take away from this experience. People might try to break you down, might try to make you feel less than, but the truth is, you are stronger than they will ever know. The injustice we had faced was real, and it had hurt us in ways words couldn't describe, but it had also taught us something invaluable. No matter how hard the battle, no matter how deep the wound, we could always rise again. We could always move forward. I had always hoped for a world where Adam didn't have to face the kind of cruelty he experienced that day. And while I knew that world might never come, I also knew we had the power to create a space for him in it. A space where he could thrive, a space where he could feel safe. Moving forward wasn't just about putting the past behind us, it was about embracing the future, about recognizing the strength we had found in each other. It was about never allowing anyone to make us feel small, to make us feel like we didn't belong. We had won, not just in the courtroom, but in our hearts, and that was something no one could ever take away. And so, with a quiet strength, we stepped forward together, stronger than ever, unbroken, and ready for whatever came next.